actually we're at number 12, so I think we're all here. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Renee Robinson, and I want to welcome you to our Language Access and Communication for Students who are Deaf Plus webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to help our parents gain knowledge needed in language and communication so that parents feel empowered enough to be influential members of their child's educational team. So welcome. Language and communication is the foundation for human life. It is a critical factor in everything we do. Language affects our socialization, education, and eventually our choices of profession. When we look at families with DHH plus children, they can face some unique challenges in language access and communication. Therefore, in this webinar, we brought in some experts that will help parents investigate some ways to address acquisition of language for our DHH plus students in the educational setting. We are going to discuss what a program looks like that is supportive of a child who is DHH plus. So with that, I would like to introduce my first guest. First, we have Pam Ormsby. Everybody wave, Pam. She's a teacher of the deaf. She has taught in classrooms as well as worked as an itinerant teacher of the deaf. She's also a parent of a hard of hearing plus adult son. So welcome, Pam.
Thank you.
Our second guest is Ann Parker. She is a general and neurodevelopmental disabilities pediatrician. Yay. She's also our monthly consultant here and is part of our CEID team. So welcome to you as well. Ann Parker. I want to say doctor so bad. Okay, but on behalf of CEID, I would like to welcome you both to the panel. So we're going to we're going to begin the webinar with some moderated questions. Okay, hold on a second. Dun, 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 dun. We're going to moderate some questions for you guys, okay? And the attendees, you guys are all welcome to add questions to the Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your panel, or add some questions to the chat box. Georgina from CEID, she's going to monitor the questions. And Georgina, if you have any, just go ahead and shoot me a private chat and I'll go ahead and try to get those up. So with that, we are going to begin. All right, so let's get started. I think the first place to begin is with language. So let's talk expressive language, and I'll start with Pam. What is the difference between receptive language and expressive language? And before you begin, I actually do have a poll. So if people want to participate, I have a cute little poll here, and it's just questioning your knowledge base. There are two questions we're going to discuss today. One is LRE. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. I just want you to find out if you've ever heard this. I also have a second question that I want to find out if the parents in this room can identify and specify their child's hearing loss. So I'm going to launch a poll. We're going to take 1 minute for you guys to fill that out, and then I'm going to share your results. And it's all anonymous. So here we go.
So fancy. Wow.
Very fancy. Sean Renee is learning a lot of things to do on the computer because I want everyone to learn lots of stuff. All right. Look at that. The numbers are changing. Oh boy. Here we go. Give you another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Has everybody answered? That's 30 seconds. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. Looks like everybody's done. Haha. So let's see. So at least 63% of the families do not know what LRE is. So we're definitely going to talk about that. And I'm absolutely happy to see that everybody can identify the hearing difference that your child has by type and degree. So that's awesome. All right. Let's see, we'll stop sharing that. Okay. So Pam, let's hit it. What is the difference between receptive and expressive language? And what does a language-rich environment look like for a child who is deaf plus?
Okay. Receptive language is what the child receives through their eyes, through their ears, and they have to make sense of it in their brain as to what that means. And expressive is how they then communicate to the world. It might be facial expression, it might be face, which we call in sign non-manual markers, and or it could be sign, it could be speech. And the important thing is, especially for very young children, is before they speak or sign, they're bringing in so much information from watching their family's face, tone of voice, and body. And when they're able to receive that, that means their brain is then working and setting up their language areas and thinking. All of you who had little babies know that when you smile at them or Google at them, they respond. And if you are signing to them from even day one, I have often seen babies when I'm going, yes, 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 or milk, 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 and I look at their little fist that's all balled up in those first weeks, and I see movement. So it says to me that even from day one, babies are taking in information, receptive language, and responding to it.
So Dr. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, and so I think it's way before. Sometimes people focus too much on what does a baby say and forget about all that time and all that information that the baby is taking in all the time. And so I encourage parents and families to use strong facial expression and body language and tone of voice and talk to the baby and sign to the baby as if they are understanding everything. And it's called reciprocal, where you're going back and forth, and that's communication, which is the foundation of formal language. But there's so much language and thinking that goes on before there are words and sentences, and it's a wonderful thing.
So with that said, Miss Ann Parker, Ann, so when we're looking at kids who are deaf plus and they have some other things going on, what can you expect language-wise, expressive-wise, of how that information gets in? Are we looking at babies that are not making facial expressions? What are we looking for?
Well, first of all,
indicate that they're actually getting it.
Yeah, it's always fun to listen to each other, isn't it? I'm just thinking to myself, yeah, Pam, speech is not necessarily just about language. Language is not just about speech. And I think so often we wait for speech. Did they go, did they babble? And we say, oh, good. But all of the other things, the expression, the movement, when we talk about communication, what is communication and what does it mean? Because I think communication sort of means I've noticed I'm not alone in the world. And even for kids who are seem very isolated, you find these little things that are a communication. They know somebody is there. And that's the basis of that turn taking or reciprocity of communication, that back and forth. I know you're there. But to go to your question, I think so much is just watching even a newborn. We sometimes tease that, but I'm not sure it's a tease, that we can learn something about a child's temperament from the beginning. When they come out, are they looking around? Are they quiet? Are they moving? Are they still? Do we hear little noises? Are they watching us? So that to me is what even a child who has real differences in their motor system, or of course in their hearing or in their vision, there are so many other clues if we just watch the child's movement, their face, and not just, do their eyes follow you, but all the things like, do their fists start to do something like this when they hear your voice change? Or do they look around a little bit? So it's looking at every component of how a child's trying to communicate. And speech is one, but all those other components are language or communication, aren't they? And they're just there from the beginning. And they pick up on all of our communications as well, which is so interesting right from the beginning.
So you just said how they're communicating, watching to figure out how they're communicating. How important is the child's communication modality? Who gets to decide that?
From my point of view, parents. Parents we know our kids better than anybody. We may not have fancy words or diagnoses or, know everything in the manual about them, but we know our kids. And so I think really asking parents how our kids communicate, and no matter what goes on in terms of modalities.
And Pam?
When we talk about total communication, we're talking about that the child is exposed to speech, the child is exposed to sign, the child is exposed to pictures and objects, and we look and see what is making sense to the child. And so certainly a child's mode of communication is going to be, evaluating that is going to be evolving as the child gets older too. What is a mode of communication when they are very young may not be the mode of communication later on. But as long as we give input in terms of communicating in all the ways that we can, facial expression, body language, speaking, signing, pictures, it gives the child the opportunity over time to see what is meaningful to them. And so I would say the parent is the one who knows the best, and that total communication, every way in which you can communicate with your child, is helpful in determining mode of formal language in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Pam, listening to you, consistency, it feels so important that child has the security of knowing that we're going to be pretty consistent in how we approach them, changing as the child's capacity to take in more and express more is there, but that there is consistency, and so they can rely on the steps that they're climbing.
So what I'm hearing from the both of you is that early on, we have this baby and we have to watch the baby for the way they communicate. They may not necessarily babble. They may not necessarily follow. They may not necessarily do all of those linear developmental milestones and reach those. So it's up to the parent and the educator to watch and let the child lead in their mode of communication. Is that what we're hearing?
Yes.
Yeah. And would you say follow, that if the parent is leading, the child then has a chance to follow?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Or teacher.
That's fantastic. So I want to move to that preferred mode. And most of our children, I think in this room, may or may not be signing, and we're looking at a total communication program. I want to know, when we have children who are using that receptive language, their receptive language is usually through signs, but they're not necessarily using the signs, and vice versa. How can a parent use this information when we're talking about placement during transitions?
Well, you know, probably most of the children before transition have had a speech therapist and a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing, and there will be reports that identify how the child is taking in information and how the child is expressing themselves. And so in an IEP, that needs to be clearly documented. This is how the child expresses themselves, and this is how the child understands information. But of course, there are some very practical aspects of a classroom that need to be taken into account to make sure that the child can see, and if they're hear the information. And those are important things I always look at in terms of placement for a child going to a new placement. Can the child see both the teacher and the other children? Because peer communication is important. And if the child is using amplification, are there at least two people in the daily environment who understand the devices and can troubleshoot and maintain them? Because we know at any minute with a little kid, they can stop working. And so those, in order to both, talking about receptive, we want to be sure, just as a ground level, that the child can see what's going on and what people are saying or signing. So a classroom that had rows would not make sense. And that's why you usually see like a half circle with not more than 8 kids, I would say, in that half circle, so that everybody can see each other. And definitely that the staff has been fully in service as to the amplification equipment, and that there's somebody there at any moment who can take the child aside or take the amplification aside and do repairs. Those are 2 basic needs for a total communication classroom, or a child who is in another kind of classroom. They have to be able to see and hear the language so that it's understood.
And Pam, everybody, I think what's so important is the conditions that allow for that, in addition to the audiologic needs or the visual needs, meaning that receptive language really means, how do I receive things? And if a child is overwhelmed, there's so much going on, they don't even know what to focus on, they can't use their receptive skills, or if it's too noisy, or if it's too much going on that they have to filter out because they don't understand it, it's not part of their experience yet. That can be an issue. And also the nature of that classroom, if you will, structured, not rigid, but enough structure so there's some facilitation, there's a guidance, so the kids kind of know what should they be trying to attend to, how did they prioritize? So I think it's so important to think of a child who's overwhelmed easily by whether it's visual clutter or noise or too much going on, that we look at classrooms and think that way, and also their peers. Who are the peers that they can focus on, relate to, be experiencing, because there's some commonality, and then who are the peers that bring something that is new. And so often, I think Pam can help here, that changes as the kids go through their education. Sometimes at the beginning, they're ready for certain things, and then they're ready for more as time goes on. So I think environment is so darn important for receptive as well.
Yes, I would say an important part of that is there needs to be at least another adult who can bracket the child if they need some security, or re-say something in a way that is meaningful or point to something. And definitely the classroom walls, the visuals can be overstimulating for some kids. So visuals, there needs to be management by the teacher so that it's meaningful but not overstimulating. Or if a child has a vision issue, that needs to be taken into account. There may need to be an aide who brings things closer to the child.
So we had one question, and it goes back to what you said about the equipment. And I know we addressed this later, but since we have this question, we have a parent who would like to know, who would you recommend training on how to troubleshoot the hearing aid equipment? So all of the technical stuff, all of the HAT equipment.
Yes, I would begin to make sure that the teacher understands it, but the teacher is very, very busy and things go wrong with little kids constantly. So, and secondly, an aide would be in service. I think most of the schools where the children are going has a speech therapist. If the speech therapist is based there and is there all the time, then that speech therapist can be a good ally in terms of understanding how to use the equipment. So I would say those would be the first three people who need to understand, multiple people need to understand, how does this equipment work? What might go wrong? And what do I do when it goes wrong?
Do you need individual aid for that, Pam?
So we discussed this earlier in our pre-op, and one of the things we came up with was really, depending on what type of program the child is placed in, making sure, because if you're looking at a classroom placement outside of a deaf and hard of hearing program, we want to make sure that that itinerant teacher is coming in and they are using some real valuable hours to do real good training, not a 5-minute training on, you put the hearing aid on. So I think to answer that question, Anne, is to say that we, as the person looking at information in the IEP, is to really front load those hours of real good training for those hearing devices, all of them, so that they're knowledgeable right from the get-go when the kid starts the program.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers that question. So we did this survey. We're going to move on from language. Oh, actually, no, we have one more question. I have a 5-year-old DHH plus child with a moderate sensory neural bilateral hearing loss who primarily uses signs and an AAC to communicate expressively, but not yet speaking. How likely is it for a child to pick up verbal speech after the age of 5? Sounds like a...
I can answer
want to
that.
tackle that?
I
Okay.
don't know the percentage, but I can tell you my son, who's 42, when he was 7, he had, I understood his speech, but other people didn't. And he had a minor surgery in the back of his throat and then was able to develop intelligible speech. It's not normal, but it's intelligible. So his expressive language was sign until age 7, and then as his speech developed, that became his primary expressive mode. And so I've seen, and with other kids, I have seen as they develop skills with a speech therapist, as you know, as they understand language, they understand the sentence and what the words are in a sentence, and they learn to read, that sometimes that boosts their speaking also. So there isn't any this way, that way, one way. Every child is so different, but it's certainly possible for kids who do not have intelligible speech at age 5 to end up having useful, let me say, useful speech with standard English as an adult. And as kids learn to use the computer too, my son communicates beautifully through the computer with standard English, and that helps for people who may not understand his speech as easily as some others. That's a long answer.
So Anne, same question, when we're looking at kids who have those pluses, and I always think of kids as seashells on the seashore. They're all different. You're not going to find two that are alike. So I think the answer is we don't know. It's possible, but when you're looking at a DHH plus kid, what are we looking at for speech?
I think it is so complicated, and the seashore is very true. And I think often people think that's a cop-out. Well, yeah, everybody's different, but I think especially with DHH plus, but not just the plus, it so depends. Ooh, that's speech. That's communication. I want to find that dog and hug it. But I think so much has to do with what other things are going on, and that no matter what's going on, we try to seek out what are some of the other things that are going on so that we can support the needs, the challenges that go with that. But I think setting a limit, like if you don't speak till 5 or you don't do this till 7, doesn't help us that much. And I must admit, I do it. If I have a child who doesn't sit till 10 months, I am worried that that child isn't going to walk till 2 years. And if they don't walk till 2 years, I worry, but those things don't pan out, especially to me with speech and language and communication, because things are built so much on other things. If I have a child who's apraxic and can't, knows the words they want, but their brain can't put those sounds together and then can't string those words, things like that, that child may not speak until a certain age. But with the things that Pam's talking about, with learning linguistic communication, if you will, learning about words and language and how to express it, may come in at a much later age. So I don't like the idea of critical periods, that there's a critical period, and if you don't do this till this age, it won't happen. And I used to have a lot of parents who came in. Time magazine in the 1990s had a magazine all about developmental disabilities. And if by 10, certain things hadn't happened, life was over. And it was like, wait a minute, the brain continues to grow. It grows, it grows. It doesn't mean that everybody turns out, typical in the way they express themselves, receive, or express language. But I think there's a danger in having these cutoffs. I also think there's realistic where you say, wait a minute, this child is going to have a lot of challenges. How do we keep meeting them? Or this child may communicate differently. But I really worry about these cutoffs because visual children with who have cortical blindness. We used to say those children would never see. And then I remember in my practice about 18, 19, looking at a couple of kids and saying, wait a minute, how did you know that was there? And they looked and said, I saw it. And my brain went, you're not supposed to see. We learned you can't see because you have cortical blindness. So I think it's really, really important to leave the doors open, and also to address things. Kids with motor issues. I see so many kids in a classroom sitting in a regular chair and not in a chair with structure, a Riften chair. Many of the parents know those, where, a little chair with handles. So I would get kids come in with, they were called intellectual disability. But if we could do some testing in a chair where they didn't have to constantly worry about slipping off the chair and falling, guess what? They seemed like they were brighter on the test. So I think you have to look at the whole child as you try to make predictions about will they speak or not. I'm not trying to be politically correct. I really feel that way. You have to keep looking at the whole child.
The whole child. That's a perfect segue here. So we did the little survey about LRE. So I'm going to tell you, it's called least restrictive environment. It can often be difficult for educational teams to appropriately support deaf and hard of hearing plus students, as sometimes, not always, the IEP team will only recognize and focus on that one eligibility, which typically is the plus part, the medical issue, the syndrome, whatever it may be, and not address the student's language and communication. The language and communication needs equity. So what do we mean when we're talking about that DHH kid plus DHH plus kid, and we are talking about not restricting their environment? Anybody?
Well, I think when we talked about that the child can see, hear what's going on, and often a child who's DHH plus has some neurological or vision or other issues besides just their audiogram hearing loss that distracts them or makes it difficult in terms of distance. So a least restrictive environment must take into account the appropriate seating for a child. If the child needs somebody, an aid behind them, helping like the chair arms or whatever to focus the child, that aid is part of the least restrictive environment. If there are so many kids in a class and they're moving around and distracting, that's not the least restrictive environment. So to flip it, we could look at MAE, which is like the most appropriate environment. And when we're talking about placement and services, why go to LRE? Why not? Why let us go to MAE, the most appropriate environment? In other words, what does this child need to be successful? And LRE for some kids is in a full mainstream classroom with an interpreter and appropriate amplification and a seating where they can see everything. But more than likely, there are differences for young children, especially young children who are DHH plus, to begin with, to get them started in school. And also, that can always be changed over time. Once you sign an IEP, doesn't mean that nothing can be changed for that whole year, because you find out this is not working. So this aspect is making this a most restrictive environment, not a least restrictive environment. So in a way, LRE is good in that we're talking about we need to attend to and change things so that the child is not restricted in learning.
And when you are looking at not restricting a child with an intellectual disability, how are we addressing that in the classroom when that child is signing?
I think I really like what Pam is saying, because I'll often at an IEP talk about the general ed classroom without appropriate support being the most restrictive environment, because the child's restricted from using their capacities. And so if they're in a classroom with 20 kids and intellectually, it's, you know, sort of a range of average intellect for the age. If that child is there not being able to take in information or not quickly enough, when they get the information, they can understand it, but they can't take it in because whether it's their hearing or their vision or their motor, they're restricted. And so if they can't communicate, if they can sign, but nobody else in the classroom signs, then they're restricted, and especially at the beginning of your life when you really want to gain the confidence that, guess what, somebody understood what I was saying and I understood them and they know I understood them. So this wonderful feedback or emotional connection that then leads to the security that I can learn and be appreciated. So if you're to finally get back to your question, if you're in a class where you sign and nobody else signs, you can't convey that you understand. And we all know what that feels like and how you are seen. So I think the restrictive piece is so important, or the most appropriate environment for that child. And the term least restrictive environment, I think, grew up around educating kids who had cognitive differences. And people would say, well, they shouldn't be isolated. That's not politically correct. Everybody should have the same opportunity. But what really was happening is everybody didn't have the same opportunity, because some of these kids who didn't have an opportunity to take the information in or express it were just floating in an ocean in a regular class, and very often starting where you have the capacity to take it in and express it. And as Pam says, in time, placements change. And as a parent, you have the right to keep reviewing that. And I even like to put that in my IEPs. If we see this, or if we meet these goals before the end of the year, what's the scope of services and interventions?
And I like what you just said about how the child sees themselves and how they feel. Can you address, and going back to what you said from the very beginning, addressing the whole child? If we're looking at this child being in an environment that is restricting them, what is that doing to their social emotional development?
It mixes it. I mean, you have to feel appreciate. You have to trust that somebody is out there who sees you, and you have to trust that you have some way to communicate with that person. And so if that's not there, I think for so many, I mean, kids are resilient in amazing ways, but we're not supporting that resilience if they're, I think, if they're not in an environment where they feel connected, they feel they're part of the scene and they're appreciated.
Pam, same question.
I think even in a deaf and hard of hearing classroom, we would have children who had multiple disabilities, and it was important that if they signed cheese, that people knew that that's what they wanted, or if they saw the little girl next to them sign something, they would have gotten some of that. Or if that child who was DHH plus signed something that maybe was not completely intelligible to other kids, the aide with that child could voice it, but just being in the background as if the child had clearly said that. And that was so important for everybody to make that child be part of the group. This child belongs to our classroom, to the extent that communication could happen. It's not only good education for everybody, but it's an emotionally supportive environment when that can happen.
There's a phrase, the courage to try. And I just see that whether it's a child who can't read or isn't learning to read like other children, or isn't learning math in the same way, or can't express themselves, if you don't have the courage to try, and you think to yourself, how do you develop the courage to try? And I think that is through that early affirmation that comes with, whether it's at home, whether it's in a preschool, whether it's in an elementary school. Because once you have the courage, you can do amazing things. They're different things for a number of kids. But how do you establish that? How does the kid learn they can do it? And as I'm hearing you talk, Pam, that really comes to mind.
We actually have an attendee who said LRE should stand for language rich environment.
Yes.
I think we probably could change that. That sounds absolutely wonderful. So when we're looking at the whole child and we have our DHH pluses, let's say in a placement within the deaf and hard of hearing classroom, what are some accommodations we're looking at inside the DHH classroom for the DHH plus? Pam.
Well, you know, depending on the child's needs, it could be that that child has an aide who is assigned to them. It could be that a child needs to, because of medical reasons, needs to have rests throughout the day. So there were times where I had a little camping tent in the corner of the classroom so that child could go and lie down and take that rest. It could be that the child needed a weighted vest on, and OT, you know, had determined that, and or arms on the chair, something that kept the kid focused because of their neurological needs. There were kids who also had visual issues, and so, you know, we might put something on the floor that would help the child see the pathways easier through the classroom. So I think for the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing to work as a team with the OT, the PT, and the speech therapist is critical, that they have time to meet together to make accommodations, because the DHH classroom is going to need accommodations as much as, you know, a general ed classroom. And that child has the right to have what they need. And I think it sends a message to the other children who may not need it too, that we take care of everybody. And
I
we're in
want
this together.
I want to stop and say, full disclosure, Pam is my son's ex-teacher, or older seasoned teacher. And we did have students in the classroom who were DHH plus, and I'm in awe of your ability to incorporate everyone in the classroom. And to this day, those kids are actually still friends. So
nice.
She knows of what she speaks. And I had to continue on that path of what you were saying about the different accommodations and what they are doing neurologically. I have to say, this is the one time I'm going to say it, Dr. Parker, how important is the neurologist in their medical opinions and the abilities of our kids when they're DHH plus and they have those intellectual issues coming up in the classroom? How important is it to contact that person? Can they contribute?
Depends who they are. How's that person? You know, I think the important thing is finding people who listen to you as parents, finding people who want to try to engage some with your child. Some people are better than that than others, of course, but I think it's very, very important because there's so many. Well, first of all, in the DHH kids, as you know, many of our kids have trouble with balance. And so no matter what classroom they're in, I want an OT evaluating the classroom with the teacher to see where are the hazards. Should they really be going outside on the slide and climbing the steps? And if they are, because they could do it, do we want kind of a pair of eyes on them? That we look at conditions that we know go with DHH that are just, I mean, the ear is the ear, and so often those are issues. Sensory, I want somebody really looking at the sensory components of the classroom. But also in terms of neurologist or developmental pediatrician, whoever, or an excellent pediatrician. There's some wonderful pediatricians out there who really know the kids and the families, and boy, I want them involved. But so many of our kids might have seizures, and so a teacher says, you know, this child just doesn't pay attention, and everybody says, oh, there's too much going on, and then we start to realize, hey, wait a minute, this little one is checking out very briefly, but if you're having a seizure, how do you follow things when you missed something? Even if it's 3 seconds, you're tuning in and out. So at CEID, one of the things that has been wonderful to me is every year those teachers find some kid where the neurologist, nobody picked something up, and then they present it because they're with the kid all the time, and it's a team. So I think it's so important that the medical person on your team is listening. And if you say, gee, I have a syndrome that where I'm worried about seizures, nobody says, oh, but you're not seeing any. Somebody says, let's think about that. Let's consider that. What should we be looking for? So I think teamwork is so important. And I think physicians on the team, but it's very important that it's somebody who listens and who wants to grow up with you and your child. It's not just a one-time consult, see you when I see you. They're being there a little bit the way you're talking about Pam being in the lives of those kids over time. That there's some medical person, especially for DHH Plus, who's just there to look at the whole picture.
Okay. So provided that, so if we're looking at placement, provided that the DHH classroom is not an appropriate placement for a DHH plus student. I mean, realistically, we know sometimes it just isn't the place. What accommodations can be made in a non-DHH classroom for the child to access that curriculum, access their peers, access school activities? Dr. Park, I mean, Anne.
All the ones that they might need, and Pam, you can help me here, in a DHH, in a specialized classroom. I mean, I think you tailor it to the kid and you look at all of those things, and intellectually, you know, if you have a child who really isn't comprehending and keeping up, that you find, first of all, you see, is there a modality, vision, hearing, whatever, that is really keeping them from that, and a place where we could address that more. But also, if you're going to be in a gen ed class and you can tolerate the sensory and you can receive and express, sometimes we'll have an aid, sometimes we'll have a shared aid, ways to make that the most appropriate environment. So it's equipment. To me, it's training, what you were talking about before. Also, having a teacher that wants the kid there. And there are situations where you have somebody who's so overwhelmed as a teacher, it's just not what they were doing. And it might not be the right classroom for that child. And Pam, you can probably address that even more than I can. I think it's the goodness of fit is so important, and then the support, and sometimes we'll have a resource teacher, an inclusion teacher who helps the teacher be a more appropriate teacher for that child. I worry about kids who are stored. I've had children who are on lying down all day long with no access to hearing or seeing that we can appreciate. And I'm wondering to myself, why are they in this classroom? And parent will say, well, they're around typical kids. And to me, a kid is a kid, and we all offer each other different things. So I worry sometimes that it looks kind and politically correct, if you will, but the child isn't gaining. So I think no matter where the child is, the question of what do they need to take in information and to express, even if there's no speech or anything, look at somebody's eyes, look at their movement. Is there connection, or what Pam said at the beginning, is there reciprocity? Is there give and take in communication? Sorry for the long answer.
No, not at all.
I would say that one of the major difficulties is the classroom teacher is just going lickety-split all day and doesn't really have the time to make adjustments, even a person who is very accepting and wants to, because they have a full classroom. And so in the IEP, some way to talk about how is the regular classroom teacher going to talk with the aide. And sometimes if there is a speech therapist who is only at that school, they're also willing to be a partner with the aide so that the aide has somebody to go to, because the classroom teacher can't leave, he or she can't just leave the class and problem solve something. And so there needs to be a pathway for the aide and the classroom teacher to have somebody else who they can problem solve with, so the child isn't just pushed off to the side, which is the worst possible situation.
Absolutely.
You know, and to that, when you're at the IEP and there's a lot of discussion of goals and how they'll be carried out, the importance of speech and language person, resource teacher, having what's called consultation time.
Yes.
So it isn't just the time, you know, a child gets 45 minutes 3 times a week with speech and language. It's the consultation time. And very often people will say, and it's true, oh, we always see each other in the hall, we always chat, we're always thinking about Johnny. But I like to have it written in. And I also like consultation time with family, because as a family, and especially when kids are younger, we're used to the nurturing preschools or places like CEID, and you miss that, and you want to know, how do you carry things on? And you don't really have consultation time with speech and language or OT, but I like it written in. Most of these people are saints and they do it anyway, but I'm always worried if the lights go out, and we really want those things written in.
Yeah, we want to have the time legally available to the people, even though we know they would like to. It gives them something that they can say, this is in the IEP, so we need to meet weekly or whatever for 20 minutes to check in. There just needs to be more coordination time. It can't just be left to the goodness, because people's time is used up already.
So I think, did you have one more, Anne?
Always. With the IEP, I think as a parent, when you start, sometimes people feel like if I load it too much, they'll think my child has so many problems they can't serve them. And again, I don't know how you feel about that, Sean Renee, but I think load it with what you need, because you can always change it. And children grow and change, and nobody feels or should feel like if they came in with multiple issues, things are going to change, and people will keep looking at your child in different ways. And
Absolutely.
It's always nice to have people amazed. So don't shortchange the needs at the beginning.
Absolutely. So we're talking about the IEP, and a lot of our parents here, from the survey, I think it said 0 to 3 and a couple of 5 pluses. So we're looking at like transition, especially during preschool. So once they leave My Little Home Visit program, they are going to be assessed by their local school district. And I am finding a lot of the time the assessors are not fluent signers, and they are testing the students. Maybe they know some. How valid and reliable are those test scores? And if they're not valid and reliable, how do we get them to be valid and reliable?
Well, parents sign an assessment form, and that's a place where they can add their viewpoint on that, where they can say, I am signing this but the assessment needs to be done, and then some list. If the assessor is not a fluent signer or is not familiar with that child's communication, then sometimes I would go in with the child, and assistants in my classroom would maintain the classroom while I did that. Or if there was an aide who I felt very confidently understood the child's communication and would be confident in speaking up and to the psychologist, interrupting the person or reiterating what the child said or meant, then that was another way. But the state program guidelines, California State Department of Education guidelines for programs of deaf and hard of hearing, outline who can assess the children and what qualifications and experiences they need to have to be able to do that. And if they don't, then there needs to be other people in the room with the child and the assessor who can give feedback to the assessor. And then as the teacher, so say the sending teacher from CEID can talk with the psychologist and ask if there are any questions or give feedback to their, usually I have a conversation with the psychologist. The psychologist also contacts the family before they assess and asks for their concerns. So, all that communication needs to happen. And a child should not be going into a room with a stranger, a young child, to do this sort of thing without somebody who is familiar with the child.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then as a teacher, the teacher has an obligation to cue the person who goes in with the child as to what you can do and what you can't do. That often the aide or interpreter would ask that question, and then they would come back and give me feedback, so then I could finish the loop with the psychologist and say, I heard blah blah blah, did you know blah blah blah. So
Good.
it's so important. Not a stranger just pops in, takes a kid somewhere, tests them, it's not in their language. No, it's not a valid evaluation.
I so agree. And I think also bilingual. If a child doesn't speak the language of the speech and language person, the psychologist, the OT, I want somebody who can communicate, and that gets to sign language. If I have a little one who knows sign language and the person testing doesn't, it's just not good enough to, I'm terrible, as you know, Sean Renee, after 30 years at
Getting there.
sign language. I can say more than cracker, but that would not really be great as the evaluation of speech and language. So I think you have to speak the same, know something about the child's language. I also think, to go back to your question about the medical person, that you can tell them who you want to evaluate. So if somebody is doing the IEP and they say, oh, you don't need OT in this, it's just a child with DHH, thank you very much, you want OT. And if you need it, talk to the pediatrician, the developmental pediatrician, the neurologist, about what are the things that they would request. And if you have trouble with it, have them write a letter saying, this child has blah, blah. And of course we want OT, speech and language, psychological, which is more that kind of thought process. And I think that I don't want everybody to be in denial, a word I don't like very much, about their child's capacity. But I also think as a parent, we're advocates, and I don't want somebody at 5 telling me the cognitive capacity of my child. I mean, you don't do that for any child. And therefore, I don't want that as a parent to look at this and say, oh my gosh, I've got DHH plus, my child's not going to learn. That's not what the evaluations are about. The evaluations are about what are the strengths and what are the challenges. and how do we take those strengths and run with them and keep looking for them, and how they've changed, and how do we take those challenges and say, these are real challenges that we're going to work on. I think too often we feel like this is a hierarchy and they know. I don't mean we and they, because there's some amazing evaluations. I'm so glad we have the system we have. But I think as we come to it as parents, it's a bit of information at a certain period of time that allows us to know, what do we do next?
Mm-hmm. We have a question from another parent. It says, how do we manage assessments when our child's multiple disabilities impact the assessment in different ways? For example, our daughter has a profound hearing loss, so they try to get her attention through visual cues, but she lacks the head control to follow those visual cues.
The beauty that the parent is looking at that and saying, even before we start the testing, what kind of environment do we set up and what are we looking for? If you start testing and you're looking for something that child doesn't have the modality to respond to, then move over to something that might be developmentally a younger ability. And, you know, I'm going to say start lower, and I mean that. Start at a level that's a little lower to see, do you get a response there? So are we talking about a cognitive response, or are we talking about a response that has to do with receptive? What is going in, or expressive? What are they able to do? And object permanence or something that comes in for a lot of kids starts somewhere around 9 to 15 months. It's why so many little ones love to drop things and have us pick them up, because they remember they dropped it, and it's an intellectual game. But if a little one doesn't have that quality yet, hasn't gotten there, then certain things on a test won't make any sense. So the importance of what, Sean Renee, you do it all the time when you assess these real little ones, where we say, okay, are they appreciating this yet? Can they process? And trying to find it that way, not by where does the test start for this age, but child cognitively, are they more 6 months? Are they more 12 months? Are they more 18 months? And then looking at, and visually, what do we need to do with their head? It's like the kids who with cerebral palsy very often come in and they're falling off the chair because it doesn't have any arms, it doesn't support them. How on earth can they make a circle when they're falling off the chair? And
yes,
I hope that answers the question, but
I agree with you. There were so many times where I actually have been able to be in the room with the assessor and they're asking a child to do something, and they are kind of just, you know, sitting on, they want them to sit on the floor because I have the little ones. And so they have to sit on the floor, and maybe they have a boppy or without a boppy or what have you. And I'm like, first of all, they're concentrating so much on having to balance themselves and sit up. They're definitely not going to watch you, and they're definitely not going to pay attention, because this child right here is using all of their energy to sit up. So if I don't have the head control to kind of turn around and do this cognitively, I think that child is getting it. I'm not going to follow the clue because I don't want to fall. So to me, that child is displaying some really good thinking processes.
Yeah.
I think it's so important that whoever's going to assess the child, and the child is unknown to them, to check in with the teacher ahead of time. And that, I know that's what usually we did. And so that helped, is to have a pre-check-in with somebody who really knows the child.
Pam, would you also recommend, in my experience, I have had several people who have parents who have told me their assessments are set up, they have a 2-hour window, and they're going, And they're going to set that child up and assess them in this 2-hour window. Could you speak to whether it's appropriate to do it a whole full 2 hours, or maybe break it up into an hour session here and an hour session there, seeing them more than one time, that kind of deal?
Yeah, and if it's a child at a school level, you know, let's let the child go to recess. Or if the child has a sense that the class is having snack or recess, you'd never want to keep the assessment going during what is that child's natural body schedule.
Right.
Also, you know, children have to go to the bathroom, they have to wiggle, they have to move, they're children. And so we cannot set assessments in a way or a place that denies who they are as children. It has to be child appropriate for that age and that child. And so again, that asks, the assessor needs to check in with the people who know the child and see what is appropriate. I mean, I can't imagine an assessment of 2 hours straight is not appropriate.
And your take on a DHH plus student sitting down for 2 hours doing an assessment?
Have you been watching my face? You
Yes.
have.
That's why I came to you. What can a parent say to these? So when they call and they say we have this window, and especially now we have, you know, COVID protocols and different things. What are some of the things parents can ask for, look for, and request for these assessments these children are going through?
Well, you know, the assessor really wants the best they can get as well. And so I think just trying to join them and say, you know, I can tell you from the start that my child fatigues after this period of time. I can tell you my child takes this much time to warm up. If you start the assessment and it looks like there's not a connection, or my child has attentional problems at age 3, I'm being facetious. It means, you know, please don't tell me my child has attentional type problems. Realize that my child's a child. So you can preload this, and it may take longer. You know, they may say, well, we can't reevaluate then for another 4 weeks. And my feeling is that you, from the outset, you can say they will, you know, don't even plan to go more than a half hour. So let's set up 4 half-hour sessions on different days rather than a one. I mean, I can't imagine well, if it's a playful person, then a 1 hour might be fine, as long as they're not testing the whole time. They're using time. And so much of the time that is used to relate to the child tells you about the child. And that's another thing with these assessments as you listen to them. It's not about how did they score, for me, especially young children. It's about how did they engage? How did they communicate? How did they receive? But I think you can front load and say, how do you plan to do this? Oh, we have a 2-hour session, or we have 2 1-hour sessions. From the start, you can dictate that. Pam, help me if that's not true. But my experience is it's true. You might not be loved immediately, but if they get to know your child, they'll respect you for having done it, and they'll get better results as well.
Well, sometimes there are people who have had to travel an hour and a half to get to the school. This is to get to an elementary school. And so then I would say the child is going to need these kinds of breaks, and we may have to do 2 different days. But again, that's the psychologist who calls me and says, I've been hired to assess so-and-so, and we have a conversation. So I would hope that for you as the teacher, that the assessor wouldn't just call the family, but that they would also call you, Jean-René, and then you would be able to give that kind of feedback, or somebody from the preschool if it's a transition thing, assessment.
Another place where you can use your physician. I mean, we don't. Well, with the DHH Plus kids, we do that actually. And I think that part of the assessment, they should have to talk to each of the people as a parent that you feel are important for feedback as part of the assessment.
Yes.
And another piece of this, which I know you'll get to, before anybody sits down to communicate what was found during the assessment, everybody has read the assessment, they have it in hand, they've read it, so that when you sit for that meeting, it really isn't just about scores and what we found. Everybody has looked. And then as a parent, you're able to say, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? Rather than for the first time being overwhelmed with information, and it's hard to prioritize what's important and what isn't.
I always advise my parents, especially during the transition period, because this is the first time they're going into an IEP, that like real official thing from three to preschool. And I always advise them, ask for their reports ahead of time. Go through the reports, even if you don't understand the scores, which, you know, most of us don't that first time, because it's going to be really overwhelming in the meeting. There's 10 other people. But if you can read through the report, outline things you don't understand, and when that person is going to present their report, instead of having them go through the whole thing and read it, just say, I've read this report, I only have a few questions, and then pinpoint those questions that you have and then move on. It helps the flow of the meeting, and they probably don't have to last 8 hours when you do it that way, right?
Yeah, and you can then focus on, because I think most of us feel like we're not getting it. It's not our field, we're not understanding it. But I think have confidence that probably understand enough, ask the questions, but the real focus is on what are the major issues, what do we really want to address, and the placement, where can these things be best addressed? Because I find that's the end, and it gets rushed through, where if you have everything ahead of time, and even if we don't understand every bit of it, we've read through it, we're able to come to that meeting saying, what are we really seeing? Because so much of the detail, it changes once you get started. And the other thing I like to do is have a couple of IEP meetings during the year, little check-ins, and before leaving the first one, you know, if the first one is in the spring, and Pam, you have to comment on this because I don't know what it feels like to the teachers, but I want in October, or everybody sitting down for a shorter meeting, talking about what did our brilliant predictions tell us about this placement and these goals. Not just how is the kid doing, how are we doing as the professionals? Did we make a good choice?
Well,
Right.
as an elementary teacher, we meet with the parents once in the fall and once in the spring at report card periods, but we're actually communicating with the parents always. And I appreciated as a teacher when the parent and I had a chance prior to the assessment or while the assessing was being done, where we could sit down and talk about what we were seeing and what people were finding and work as a team before you go into the IEP, so that the parent and I were partners as we went into the IEP. And of course, most of our parents were counseled to take the IEP home, not to sign it on the day of the IEP, which then gives them another chance to see what seems appropriate and what doesn't, and to address it further. And just, you know, the parents sometimes would say at the beginning of the meeting, I have a process here, and I hope you can be okay with that, but I will be taking the IEP home at the end of the meeting. So there's not some, you know, kerfuffle at the end of it. And, you know, it's your child. It's okay to ask that.
So we're looking at a lot of the talk we have here is about that placement and the transition. So once we've had that assessment and there's an offer of placement. For our DHH students, sometimes they are not always placed in our deaf and hard of hearing programs. Most of the time, a lot of the time, they're placed in a classroom that's labeled moderate to severe or severe to moderate. When we look at what we've been talking about, the access to the language, looking at their modality of language, how do parents address the itinerant offer? And the itinerant teacher is a teacher of the deaf who will usually come in a couple of times. So we've already discussed, they're going to teach them how to use the equipment. But how do we address that itinerant's job for language access outside of a deaf and hard of hearing program where no one else is signing?
Well, as an itinerant teacher, you are coming into a classroom that's already underway and you're pulling a child out or observing. You know, really, you are not changing the language of that classroom. So you have to, the child should not be placed in the classroom if the language that's happening in that classroom is not appropriate or is not giving the child full communication, whether there's, and I think the hiring of interpreters or the language of the interpreter has to be addressed when a child is placed in that classroom too. That's an issue. So the itinerant can check the hearing aid equipment, can, you know, receive a phone call and run on over if something's not working. The itinerant teacher can take the child out and check in with certain things or take the work that the child's doing in the classroom out with them, which gives the itinerant a sense of what the child, is the child able to work at that level in that subject. But you know, there's no comparison with being in a DHH classroom. No comparison.
Also, in the Gen Ed class, to make sure one has access to the resource teacher or an inclusion teacher, meaning that you're looking at the academics as academics start, or the pre-academics, you know, the readiness for curriculum that's being assessed in the Gen Ed. So if you have a child who is struggling with the early learning piece of it, but it seems like the general ed class would be appropriate, that we've got the other services, whether it's an inclusion teacher who comes in, works with the child in the classroom, and at the child's level. So you're not just trying to keep up with the curriculum, but that child may have a separate curriculum in the classroom that is parallel, but not so discrepant that they're not getting something out of being there for some aspects, but that they have a parallel curriculum so that if everybody's studying trains, they're studying something about trains at a level that they can understand, and they're presenting that information when it's circle time. They're participating, because if they're not participating, they're not learning. They're not having a chance to appreciate themselves. They're not having a chance cognitively to use what they're learning. So I think we've got to find a way that they are participating. They're not just sitting there. And part of the way for that is some real assessment of how much can they benefit from being in that classroom, how much can they give the other kids, how much can they get from the other kids. But parallel curriculums, whether it's they go to a resource center and learn and come back into their classroom and utilize that, and or whether we're seeing more and more in the old days, you know, the ancient days when I was a child, they used to have the bluebirds and the red birds and the whatnot. They didn't tell us that they were different levels of reading, the non-reader, the kind of getting it, and the super duper reader. And I think I hope we're seeing a little bit more of that in Gen Ed now. Not everybody learns in the same way or at the same pace, so that a child with a DHH plus who may cognitively not be learning in the same way, if they're going to be in a Gen Ed classroom, and there may be many benefits to that, that there is a way for them to learn and participate, and that we bring in the staff that's needed to help them with that. And of course, if you have 2 or 3 kids at a level, that's wonderful, because then you have, Pam was talking about before, you have a group that can learn together and compete with each other, which is part of
Right.
learning, whether we.
Yeah.
I would add one thing. If a child, I think a full inclusion teacher, mild to moderate teacher can do all those adaptations and be support and work with the classroom teacher. And there needs to be something in the IEP that person has some input from a teacher of the deaf, itinerant teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing, to help them understand the implications of a hearing loss, of that child's hearing loss, and to be available to the full inclusion or moderate, severe, mild, moderate teacher.
Boy, that's important, Pam. And I hadn't even thought about that, because I just, that assumption, of course they know that, and of course they don't know that. And that's the visual specialist, the other piece of that is somebody who knows how to help kids communicate with each other. And so often it's the speech and language person, but there is time allotted for facilitating or, social language. And even if a child is not autistic, which would be an example of the greatest difficulty of being able to engage reciprocally back and forth, understand communication. But with all of our kids where language and speech and communication is an issue, what's carved out in our IEP for a certain amount of time in a certain way to be able to socialize? And because I think that's what so much of communication is about, how to engage with each other. So you don't have to have a specific, social language disability to, and our DHH kids so often get these funny extra diagnoses because they don't have the confidence to engage, or they haven't had the experience. They haven't been in the world in the same way as all those other kids in Gen Ed, picking up incidental language, hearing everything that's going on, and incorporate all those things. Their experience has been different. And so how do we get somebody in the classroom? Sometimes, often you have magnificent teachers, and I think most parents are going to be really pleased by what happens in the school system. But I think you have to set it up.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have 5 minutes left in our webinar. I would like to summarize. So what I think I've heard is some of the important things to talk about is to, as a parent, recognize your child's uniqueness. It has to be honored. It has to be respected. Their communication mode has to be honored. It has to be respected. And to make sure that accommodations and intervention strategies focus on your child's strengths and that they help support your child. Does that sound about right? Yeah. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to look at the box again. I would like to thank our wonderful guests. There are no more questions. Cool. For attending and sharing your expertise and experience. That was really, really helpful. I hope all of our attendees got some really good notes, some great tidbits of information. And I hope that this helps you with your journey. Let's see, we have is there a question? I just got a little, no? Let's see.
I was just saying that Cindy's on if you wanted her to say hi.
Oh, Cindy's on? Oh, there she is. Hi, Cindy, do you want to say anything?
No, I am sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and the most fabulous panelists. Among the three of you, you've got all the knowledge in the world here, and with all of the parents being able to take in this great information, it's just such an honor. And I love listening and learning, from all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy. Cindy is our executive director here at CEID. So it's great to have her kind of listening in and yaying along. I would like to thank all of our attendees as well. I do hope you got some information. Please fill out a survey that will follow. It should come in your email. It'll pop in because it's all all set up that way, I hope. And it just helps us know what you guys need, know what you guys want to hear about, and it helps us provide more programming just like this. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
Pam. Bye,
everybody.
Anne. Thank
Bye.
you.